It was June 30th, 1924, a day like any other for most Americans, including U.S. President Calvin Coolidge's 16-year-old son, who had gone out to the White House lawn to play tennis with his brother. He was an impatient boy that day as he had failed to put socks on, no doubt in part because it was 91 degrees in the capital. It might not have seemed like much to him at the time, but unfortunately, that directly contributed to him developing a blister, which in turn became infected with staphylococcus. Although staph could be harmless on the skin, unfortunately, it went into his bloodstream, sealing his fate. By July 2nd, he had a fever, was limping, and had swollen glands. By the 5th, he had to be removed to Walter Reed Hospital. By the 7th, he had developed full-blown sepsis, which resulted in his passing at 10:20 p.m. that evening. It seems hard to comprehend that just under 100 years ago, state-of-the-art healthcare in one of the world's richest countries didn't have the tools to treat a blister-borne illness affecting a president's family member. But on the other hand, that can also show how much progress we've made since then. The idea that a blister, or that even once horrifying diseases from the 20th century like typhoid, tetanus, measles, polio, smallpox, syphilis, or diphtheria could be debilitating or fatal, at least in the West, seems almost unimaginable thanks to modern medical advances. Our medical science has followed us into the space age and beyond. With the human genome sequenced, we've been able to double the lifespan of cystic fibrosis patients. With lasers, we can reliably perfect eyesight. With modern surgical technologies, we can perform heart transplants or hair transplants. Although the unstoppable march of science has conquered everything from once fatal diseases to cosmetic blemishes, there's one medical problem that seems to defy every solution. One responsible for severe chronic diseases, including stroke, coronary heart disease, osteoarthritis, type 2 diabetes, and even cancer. This disease has exploded to such an extent that it's been classified as a public health crisis and national epidemic, collectively causing 1 in 5 deaths in America. To put that statistic into perspective, that's nearly as many deaths as smoking causes per year. And that disease is obesity. Obesity is a lot more complicated than we've been led to believe, which is why it should come as no surprise that public health advocates have attempted to oversimplify it. Given that smoking and obesity have similar poor impacts on long-term health, it should come as no surprise that they attempted to replicate the anti-smoking campaign's tactics, which have this stick and carrot approach, both encouraging people to make healthy choices and reminding them that if they don't...
All right, what do we got?
Just came in. Heart attack. 5'9", 300 pounds, 32 years old.
How the hell does that happen?
Now, you do have to give them something, as the campaign against cigarette consumption has been a resounding success and resulted in decreased cigarette consumption in almost every year since its inception, and this is despite tobacco having a similar addiction profile to heroin. Regardless, there has been a lot of controversy surrounding the approach, primarily due to the fact that it's no longer 1964, and people don't respond to being shamed as well as they once did. Fair enough. It might be overkill to put a Surgeon General's warning on the side of a Pop-Tart box, but it would also be fair to say that through one channel or another, pretty much everyone knows about the consequences of overeating. Despite that, obesity has been on the rise for a long time, rapidly taking off in the 1980s and increasing almost every year since then. By how much, you ask? Well, to put it into perspective, in 2016, Lesotho, the 163rd country in the world by GDP, had an obesity rate of 16.6%. In 1975, obesity prevalence was less than 10% everywhere in the world, except Nauru and Bermuda, where it was still less than 20%. Okay, bizarre. So, what's changed since the 1980s? The two main culprits we hear over and over again are that people eat more and exercise less. Where are they? The US certainly still has an inactivity problem, but there has been a slight positive trend in adults meeting the CDC's federal physical activity guidelines for aerobic and strengthening activity. Daily US calorie consumption can also be lumped into the slightly good news pile, with consumption essentially having flatlined since 2005. Obesity rates, however, show no signs of slowing, nor do rates of severe obesity. Okay, so is it the type of food we're eating? Is it junk food? I mean, on a common sense level, junk food is the most obvious explanation. Let's be real. I personally can accidentally eat 2,000 calories of a large stuffed crust pizza, but I don't think I've ever accidentally eaten the equivalent of 18 pounds of spinach. But once again, if we dig a little bit deeper, we can see that junk food predates the 1980 spike in obesity rates by a lot more than you would think. Although there's no specific year junk food was invented, virtually all the staples of junk food today, be it hamburgers, chips, candy bars, sodas, you name it, were invented and popularized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And believe me, they were heavily popularized too. Cracker Jacks, for example, had become the world's best-selling snack by 1916. Babe Ruth candy bar inventor Otto Schnaring aggressively promoted his goods by renting an airplane and dropping them by parachute over Pittsburgh. Coca-Cola was literally using 9 milliliters of, well, you know what, and I'd like to get monetized one day, so we'll just drop that for now, but use your imagination. No wonder it was originally marketed as a brain tonic that could relieve headaches. Anyway, the ability to quickly pay for and consume fast food also significantly predates the 1980s spike in obesity. Dairy Queen invented the soft serve in 1946, McDonald's pioneered French fries in 1949, Dunkin' Donuts came around in 1950, KFC in 1956, Pizza Hut in 1958. Well, you get the point. So, it might be fair to say that increased junk food consumption contributes to weight gain, but something other than junk food is making people want to eat more of it. Something else is going on here. We know this because even feral and domesticated animals that live in close proximity to humans, regardless of whether they source their own food or are fed regimented diets that have changed little over the past decades, are gaining weight. A 2010 study found that all investigated males and females of 12 different species had gained weight, at a rate of up to about 30% per decade since 1971, which researchers estimated as having a this many percent probability of happening by chance. Now, feral rats consuming junk food thrown away in city dumpsters might explain the almost 7% per decade increase in urban rat obesity, but what about the 3.5% per decade increase in lab rats? Or the 12.5% decade increase in lab mice? As the paper itself noted, laboratory animals are on highly controlled diets, which have varied minimally over the last several decades. These animals are typically fed ad libitum, so if weight increases are attributable to increases in food consumption, which is possible, it is difficult to understand why animals in controlled environments on diets of constant consumption are consuming more food today than in previous decades. Yep, you heard that right. And the scientific community is aware of this problem, so much so that they're now concerned how many standard control rats and mice used in biomedical research are sedentary, obese, glucose intolerant, and on a trajectory to premature death. Now, the counter to all this is obviously, okay, if they feed lab rats as much as they want and then have them sit in small enclosures where they don't get a comparable amount of exercise, of course they'll get fat. But that too didn't used to be the case. In fact, back in the 1970s, graduate student Anthony Sclafani was having difficulty getting his lab rats to gain weight, even when feeding them with pellets made mostly from Crisco and lard. The rats would simply eat what they needed to maintain their body weight and then stop. But one day, he accidentally placed the rat in an enclosure where a fellow student had left an unfinished bowl of Fruit Loops. Rats generally stick to the foods they know, but this time was different. The rat made a beeline for the chow and wolfed it down. Sclafani was intrigued, and he set up an experiment to find out how much the rats actually liked Fruit Loops. Finding that they drove the rats crazy, literally overriding their survival instincts. In his experiment, Sclafani took advantage of the fact that rats typically favor the edges of their surroundings as a survival strategy. He initiated the test by putting the rats in a room, and first he placed a heap of standard rat chow in the center. Predictably, the rats chose safety over food, staying close to the periphery. They knew that foraging the meal in the middle wasn't a life or death situation, so they made the smart choice. However, when Sclafani switched out the rat chow for Fruit Loops, the scenario played out differently. Each of those rats, driven by the allure of the sugary treat, took the gamble and dashed into the open center. Intriguingly, this behavior persisted even when the rats weren't hungry, showing how addicted they'd become. Sclafani had found that the rats had the same addiction to other supermarket foods like chocolate chip cookies, salami, cheese, marshmallows, milk chocolate, and peanut butter. He affectionately dubbed it the cafeteria diet, but these are all what we today would call processed foods. Okay, so there you have it. Processed foods are driving people to eat more than they would otherwise, and that makes them obese. Except, even that's not the whole story. Because it turns out a calorie today isn't the same as a calorie in the 1980s. No, really. I mean, a given person in 2006, eating the same amount of calories, taking in the same quantities of macronutrients like protein and fat, and exercising the same amount as a person of the same age did in 1988, that is to say, they controlled for literally everything, would have a BMI that was about 2.3 points higher. In other words, people in 2006 were about 10% heavier than people were in the late 1980s, even following the exact same diet and exercise plans. So it turns out that even if we fixed calories in, calories out, we're still more obese than we were. What gives? Well, it turns out that the same class of chemicals found in processed foods contributing to obesity are also found in industrial products that have leaked into the soil and water supply. Collectively, that class of chemicals are known as obesogens. Obesogens are chemicals that disrupt parts of the endocrine system responsible for weight regulation. They're a subset of a broader class of endocrine-disrupting chemicals, that is to say, chemicals that were originally designed for consumer or industrial uses, but mess with your body's hormones. Although a variety of studies had been conducted starting in the late 1970s tying various well-known industrial chemicals to weight gain, the primary focus of that research was on these chemicals' toxicity. After all, there was no obesity epidemic at the time, so their ability to induce it was considered as nothing more than an unconcerning and curious side effect. The first systematic review of this research only came out in a 2002 review article by Dr. Paula Bailey Hamilton. Her paper wasn't widely cited at the time, but it should have been a bombshell. It showed that the existing research had identified not just a handful of chemicals that caused obesity, but a great number of them, and that they were in so many different materials like fireproofing, pesticides, plastics, heavy metals, solvents, you name it, that a carpet ban on obesogens would have been almost impossible. Some of the chemicals her paper listed had been banned for decades, like DDT or PCBs, but others hadn't been. The most alarming class of obesogens that Bailey Hamilton singled out that are still in active use are organophosphates. This class of chemicals is widely used in both domestic and agricultural pesticides, flame retardants, and also for pest control such as flea and tick collars and lice shampoo. They can get into your body if you consume fish, dairy, or other fatty products coming from an animal that itself consumed organophosphates, as well as through inhalation or skin contact. So pretty much anywhere. As if that weren't bad enough, childhood exposure to them can permanently reprogram a certain enzyme in the liver, adenylyl cyclase, to become more active. This signals the body's cells to produce more cyclic AMP, which you can think of as the messenger telling parts of the cell what to do. More cyclic AMP in the cell means more sensitivity to a range of inputs or signals, including several different receptors and hormones that tell the liver to produce more glucose and lipids and to slow their metabolism. This essentially creates conditions in the body that resemble prediabetes, and you can see where this is going from here yourself. Organophosphates can also increase food intake and cause you to gain more weight than you would otherwise, by altering your gut microbiome, and by interacting with certain common enzyme profiles, which 50 to 70% of people have. Now, bear in mind, that's just how one type of obesogen works. The problem in combating their effects is that they all work differently. Some, like tribulatin, a toxin that keeps barnacles and other sea pests from growing on the hulls of ships, decrease leptin, a hormone that tells your body you've eaten enough. Others still, like organotins, which are found in clothing, wallpaper, medical devices, household piping, food containers, and toys, cause the growth of new fat tissue. Atrazine, the second most used herbicide in the US, which also just so happens to contaminate 94% of US drinking water, lowers testosterone and increases estrogen levels, which indirectly contributes to male obesity. So I guess the point I'm trying to make in all of this is that while yes, junk food does cause weight gain, the reason you want to eat more junk food than your parents or grandparents has less to do with your lack of willpower and more to do with the chemical and saturated environment in which we live. Now, although it's no longer scientifically controversial to say that substances can contribute to weight gain, science doesn't yet have an exact answer as to what % of obesity is directly tied to it, or what exact sorts of people are at heightened risk of sensitivity to which sorts of obesogens. After all, this is a fairly new field. In general terms, the correct answer is almost always it's complicated. Some people whose weight can be linked to obesogens will be able to lose their weight, and some of those people will be able to keep it off, while others won't be able to do either. I realize that might be a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, because a lot of us still cling to the idea that being thin is attainable if you work hard enough for it. But therein lies the rub. While it's true that failure is an orphan, it's just as true that success has many fathers, and almost everyone who loses or is able to maintain a normal weight thinks that the granted, legitimately hard work they put into it is the sole cause of their success, which anyone can replicate. Sometimes that's true, but in this case, the reality is much more complicated. But I don't want to leave you without hope, so it's important to bear in mind that science isn't standing still on the issue of weight loss. This new class of GLP-1 weight loss medications like Wegovy and Mounjaro, who by the way are not sponsoring this video, have great promise, with clinical trials showing up to 15% loss in body weight. And that's just what's on the market. The Phase 2 clinical trial results for retatrutide, published in July 2023, showed patients losing up to 24% body weight over 48 weeks, a result comparable to bariatric surgery. But the Phase 3 clinical trial is expected to run until late 2025, so for now the final jury is out on this one. Moreover, increased public awareness of the harm caused by obesogens and other endocrine-disrupting chemicals has spurred a campaign to ban them. Earth Justice, for example, successfully campaigned to have a bill introduced to Congress in August 2022 to ban organophosphates, so we can't say that progress isn't being made. So, at the intersection of science and determination, we're not powerless in our struggle with weight. With each new discovery, we come closer and closer to a future where a healthier, more vibrant life isn't just a distant dream, but a reachable horizon. Thanks for watching this first edition of Novel Perspectives. I'd like to remind you to like and subscribe because I'd like to make more deep dives into topics where scientific consensus and public opinions differ, and if you made it this far into the video, chances are you'd like to see them too. If you have any topics you'd like me to dive into, feel free to leave me a comment or a suggestion. And again, thank you for your watch.